So welcome everyone who's in the Zoom room to another episode, another lecture that we are presenting today. The Ali Vural Ak Center for Global Islamic Studies is honored to have Dr. Nur Sobers-Khan with us today, presenting on a series of lithograph texts that that sort of present various kinds of talismans that help us to kind of reflect on elements of cosmology and divination in Islamic art, and also to help us to reflect on the connection between sort of lithograph production in the more contemporary era and earlier genres of Islamic art. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Nur Sobers-Khan with us today from MIT, where she is the new director of the Aga Khan Documentation Center, which is a research center dedicated to archiving and studying Islamic art, visual culture, architecture, that serves the Aga Khan program in Islamic architecture at MIT. Previously, Dr. Sobers-Khan was lead curator for South Asian collections at the British Library in London, where she was responsible for digitizing and curating collections there that had to do with the history of Islam in South Asia in particular. And while she was there, she was also the principal investigator for a project that involved digitizing 2 centuries of Indian print. Previous to that, she curated an exhibition on Qajar women at the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, Qatar, and her publications include a book based on her PhD research entitled Slaves Without Shackles, Forced Labor and Manumission in the Galata Court Registers, about the Ottoman Empire, published in 2014, and also Qajar women, images of women in 19th century Iran, published in 2016. She has also published reviews and articles in journals like Orients, the Journal of Early Modern History, Critical Muslim, and Global Intellectual History. She has, in addition, lectured at the University of Cambridge, where she received her PhD, and also had taught and directed a new program or a department in comparative liberal studies at the Habib University in Karachi, Pakistan. So it is with great pleasure that we have Dr. Sobers-Khan to present to us today on an aspect of Islamic art that, as she will tell us, often gets ignored. Go ahead, Dr. Sobers-Khan.
Great, thank you. And thanks so much. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And a huge thank you to Hussein, to Aisha Noor, and to Sumaiya, Dr. Hamdani, for inviting me here today. It's always a pleasure to have the chance to share my research and have a conversation and get feedback from the audience. So, I really look forward to, to interacting with you afterward. I see some of you in the audience. I know you from previous conferences and scholarship and social media, and so it'll be a pleasure to interact in the Zoom dimension and get your comments on my work. So can everyone see the first slide of my screen? It should just be the main slide. Can someone nod or give me thumbs up that it's clear?
Yes, we see it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure that that's still working. So I'm going to try, so my presentation is a bit long for half an hour. So I'm going to try and condense it as much as possible so that we keep the time. Because my moderator, we want to be respectful of her time, and she has a lecture right afterwards. So I'm going to try and be really strict with what I present to you today. So this project that I'm presenting today, some of you in the audience, I suspect, might already have seen an earlier incarnation of this project when I was still at the British Library, because I've been working on it since then. Basically, as part of my role there as the lead curator for South Asia collections, I was involved in researching print and manuscript materials from Islamic South Asia, specifically in Urdu. And that's how this research came about. I'm sorry, I'm still figuring out how to navigate. There we go. Okay, so just to quickly give acknowledgement to the funders of the project. So I was principal investigator of a project, 2 Centuries of Indian Print, while I was at the British Library. This was a research and digitization project funded by the AHRC and the Newton Babha Fund. And the goal of this was to really make accessible and also research the earliest printed texts emerging from South Asia in the British Library's collections. And it was a huge project. It's still going. They were able to renew the funding. So that's excellent news. And we have some forthcoming publications coming out of a workshop we did in 2018 around the topic of Islam and print in South Asia. So the research that I'm going to present to you today stems out of this project and out of the workshop that we held at the British Library in late 2018. I know some of you in the audience are contributors to that workshop, so I apologize at how late we've been to get the volume out. Between pandemic and international moves, there's been a bit of a delay, but I can promise you there will be some very nice research and publications forthcoming. So my research focuses on a corpus of materials that are primarily in Urdu. So I'll just quickly talk you through these materials that I encountered in the British Library's collections. So just a quick word about lithographs. Lithographs are a print technology whereby, just in case people are not aware, often it's, there's not a lot of knowledge about what lithographs actually are. So they're a technology that was sort of introduced into the subcontinent in, I guess, the sort of second quarter of the 19th century, and then really took off in the middle of the 19th century in South Asia. And instead of using movable type, the lithograph technology is basically uses a chemical process whereby script or imagery is imposed on a lithograph stone, which is a specific type of stone that absorbs certain chemicals that can then be used as a basis for reproducing either text or images thousands of times before the chemicals and ink need to be renewed. So the benefits of lithograph are that in many ways it can reproduce manuscript culture quite closely, obviously with new innovations and with some limitations as well. But I just wanted to say a quick word on what a lithograph is actually before we even get started. So what's interesting, of course, about lithographs is that they can be mass produced and distributed much more widely than a manuscript can, which, if you're talking about an illustrated manuscript in the 19th century, that would be primarily a luxury object that not everyone would be able to have access to. So this is the technology that we're discussing today, and it really took off in sort of after 1857 in many respects in South Asia. And so the materials that we'll be looking at today are primarily post 1857 lithographs that were produced on presses in the north of the subcontinent, sort of Lucknow, Kanpur, Delhi, sort of that area. So that's just a brief word about that. So my talk starts with a bit of a mystery. My own background is in Islamic studies. I'm not a South Asianist by training. And so as I was looking through the collections that I was responsible, I came upon these very intriguing lithographed treatises that can really only be described as a sort of pastiche of images, as you can see here. And there was a sort of collection of these, like a cluster, a corpus, if you will, of these lithographed treatises that all dealt with questions dealing with cosmology, divination, talismans, magic, different types of divinatory and occult sciences, sort of all grouped together within a subset of the British Library's collections called the vernacular tracts. Just a brief word about that. The British Library has sort of very extensive collections of materials that would not otherwise have been collected, sort of things like grey literature, popular literature, things that were perhaps not considered worth collecting at the time, and so often don't really exist elsewhere in great numbers. And this is as a result of the 1876 Press and Registration of Books Act, which was basically a colonial surveillance law, whereby the British required one copy of every title published in South Asian languages to be deposited in the India office and the Oriental Printed Books and Manuscript Library. And so this is why we have such extensive collections of, very popular vernacular literature that seems to have, as far as I can gather, circulated quite widely and not necessarily have been produced for a particularly, elite audience as such. And we'll get to that as we examine some of the images. So as you can see here, so the set of treatises that I focus on today, and then there's a wider set of research around the sort of wider kind of constellation of divination materials within this corpus. But what I look at today are texts that sort of fall under the title of the Tilismat-e Ajaib. And that roughly translates to wondrous talismans or talismans of wonder, and has a clear echo with the manuscript genre, the Ajaib al-Makhluqat, which I'm sure many of you in the audience will be familiar with. And I'll talk about a bit as well. So when I first encountered this set of lithographs, it's both very puzzling and very familiar at the same time, if you're familiar with the Islamic manuscript tradition of the Ajaib al-Makhluqat, for instance, or geographical and divination, or geographical and cosmological treatises. At first glance, one would look at these images in these lithographed texts and say, well, this must be a sort of reproduction of a pre-modern, geographical treatise or a pre-modern cosmological treatise, whereby you encounter, wondrous creatures and beings that are somehow situated between, the human and the animal realm. And however, as one pages through these lithographed treatises, which I should clarify are all in Urdu, so they're in a vernacular language rather than, say, Arabic or Persian or Sanskrit. As one pages through them, it becomes more and more puzzling how the images fit together, why they've been selected, what the narrative attached to them is, what the visual program is, why the author or the lithograph producer has selected them and chosen to arrange them in the way that they've been arranged. And basically, where does this type of production fall within the sort of wider understanding of kind of pre-modern Islamic intellectual history? Can we assign this lithograph production to a particular genre that sort of already exists? Can we identify where it falls? And it becomes very difficult to do that the more one looks through these images. So for instance, and I've provided you with little captions here. I imagine many people in the audience can read Urdu, Persian, Arabic. But just in case, there are some captions that the captions in English are just about as useful as the captions in Urdu. They're not very useful. They just sort of describe what's there in very brief terms and don't give you much more information than that. Like, okay, flying turtle creature, but why? Why do we have a flying turtle creature? There's not much of an explanation provided. So as you can see, the lithographs have this sort of layout whereby what you would expect in a sort of pre-modern cosmological treatise or a geographical treatise would be some kind of narrative describing, like, this area, this region, and then this region, and then this region, or this realm, and the celestial realm, and the terrestrial realm. You don't have any such spatial or temporal narrative imposed on these images on the page. Nor is there any other kind of narrative, for instance, a series of adventures or stories or anything like that. It's not even, a kind of story within a story or nothing. There's no narrative associated with it. They're very postmodern. You just they're juxtaposed, they're there on the page, and you as the curator or the researcher or the reader have to kind of make sense of where they've come from. So as you can see, though, many of them are very familiar as you look. Others are not at all familiar. And it's this fascinating pastiche and kind of melange and juxtaposition of imagery that's clearly been drawn from a pre-modern Islamic manuscript, a Persianate manuscript tradition, and other images that you have no idea where they've come from and what they're doing there and why they've been placed side by side. So it's a fascinating set of materials. And so I was very intrigued to pursue a bit further. So basically just to kind of make sense of these, and also I feel that these texts give rise to a lot of really interesting sort of historical questions as well. For instance, who was the readership of these texts? Did they, this is clearly a formulation of a new type of lithographic print artifact. Did it also give rise to new types of readership, new types of reading, new audiences? What was the logic of the creators of these artifacts, of these lithographs, when they produced them? Was it purely commercial? Was there, a philosophical sort of underpinning to their selection of images and texts? And slowly, as I go through these lithographs, arriving at answers to these questions, so we can discuss that a bit more in the conclusion. So again, just to give you, my PowerPoint is very rich in imagery, just to give you a sense of everything that these texts contain. And what they will usually contain is between 80 to 100 images, just like this, with a bit of text at the bottom, providing a caption, but without a unifying narrative. And the caption is purely descriptive. So as I said before, you have, sort of classical Persianate mythical creatures that appear, as well as stories that, perhaps exist in other traditions, but were new to me within my sort of very limited training within, sort of Islamic intellectual history. So again, just to give you a sense of some of the inventiveness of some of the illustrations, and as well as the references to the classical legends and mythology and stories that circulate, throughout the Islamic world, and also certainly in South Asia. Such as the tree of Waq or Harut and Marut upside down in a well in Babylon after they've been punished, for teaching magic to man, or whichever version of the story you would like to follow. So that gives you a sense of the material that I encountered. And this is not just one treatise, it's several. There are about, I forget the exact numbers, but let's say maybe upwards of 50 divination treatises within this corpus, of which a decent subset, maybe 10 to 15, are illustrated in this exact manner. So it's actually, and if you think that each treatise has 80 to 100 images in it, some of which repeat, it's actually quite a big visual corpus to make sense of within this context of this nascent technology of lithography being spread, in a post-1857 economic and political context, with, of course, the sort of question looming in the background of sort of the rupture of modernity and the assumption that print technologies brought about a rupture and led to the dissemination of Islamic texts, as opposed, quote unquote, enchanted understanding of sort of cosmology and magic and divination. Although, of course, those categories can be problematized and need to be problematized. It's obviously not a simple division like that. So as I asked in the first half of this, sort of talking about what do these images mean? They're not accompanied by a narrative. The sort of curator, manuscript curator in me wanted to identify which manuscripts they're drawing on, and how do we go about doing that? Can we identify a specific visual corpus that was circulating, that the craftsmen and artists who were creating these lithographs were drawing on? The answer turns out to be yes, actually. And then, the question I posed before, what readership or audience were these pastiche texts aimed at? Who was the readership and how were people reading them? It's difficult to come to an answer, so I have a bit of a speculative one based on other texts that existed at the time and previously. And then, and again, going back to this question of how did these images circulate and how were they formulated? So to give you a bit of an answer to that question, because I actually managed to identify, or I think I managed to identify the specific manuscripts that these lithograph images come from, which I say this is very straightforward. It actually wasn't that straightforward at all. And I consider it quite a fun achievement. So I'll present you with those manuscripts in a moment. But I made reference as I was going through the lithograph treatises to the Ajaib al-Makhluqat, the Wonders of Creation and Divination treatises, with the assumption that many people in the audience would already be familiar with these genres. If not, I can do just a quick description of these. So the Ajaib al-Makhluqat wa Gharaib al-Mawjudat was sort of cosmological. It depends really on which scholar you ask how this type of text was defined, but it was fundamentally a text. The first version of it came about, or one of the earliest versions came about, written by Al-Qazwini, who was a scholar, a 13th century scholar. His text is the first illustrated version. You actually have a previous unillustrated version by Tusi, if I'm not mistaken. And the first section describes the celestial realms and all of the planets and spheres and the inhabitants of the celestial realm. And the second section discusses the terrestrial realm and includes the four elements, the climes, the three kingdoms of nature. And so there's a lot of scholarly debate about how to understand and characterize the Ajaib al-Makhluqat genre. I'm certainly no expert on this. There are experts on this, among whom Stefano Carboni and Persis Berlekamp, who've written extensively on this topic. Art historians tend to understand the Ajaib al-Makhluqat genre as a sort of book of wonder meant to evoke in the reader and the viewer of the imagery a sense of sort of wonder at God's creation. However, there are other scholars who argue that this notion of wonder and the wondrousness of the images being central to this genre is actually just a Western scholarly construct and is not at all the way that these texts and images were meant to be read. It was fundamentally a scientific account of the natural world, to the readers at the time. So there's a bit of debate, needless to say, on as to what the original kind of meaning and intent of these texts were, and it can be debated. I don't have any answers myself. And personally, I do think that the later version, by the time you get to the 19th century, the way that these images are being reproduced, I do feel that they were meant to evoke a sense of, if not wonder, at least kind of even entertainment, merriment, enjoyment in the viewer. Also because of the way that they are juxtaposed together. I feel that, if you think in pre-modern times, there wasn't as much access to sort of figurative or figural imagery just in the public sphere. So having a mass-produced lithograph with such an array of sort of enticing and bizarre imagery, or maybe it wasn't bizarre to the people at the time, but was certainly very detailed and intricate, I feel that it would have evoked a certain sense of wonder. But that is just my own speculative opinion. So this is, again, just to give a sense of some of the imagery in the manuscript tradition of the Ajaib al-Makhluqat. I've supplied some images here, such as the celestial phenomena. Quickly skip through these because I would like to finish as close to on time as possible. And I suspect that this audience already has quite a decent understanding of what the imagery of the Ajaib al-Makhluqat consists in. So again, things like Harut and Marut, this classical mythology that gets remediated in these sort of 19th century lithographs, is present in the earliest versions of the Ajaib al-Makhluqat, as well as, we had an image of a turtle, a very stylized turtle as well in the lithographs. And, you find resonances and echoes back and forth between the visual program of the manuscripts and the lithographs. So I will get to my main point. And again, divination, I spoke about a little bit at the beginning as well. So my theory about these lithographs is twofold. So I'll just get straight to the point because I've only got 5-10 minutes left before we should start our discussion. First of all, the question of where the images come from turns out to be very answerable, I think. So if you look at the imagery in the lithographs, they can be, some of it, not all of it, a large subset of the images can be traced back to a set of lithographs that were published in Urdu and Persian in Lucknow in the 1860s and 70s. These lithographs, in turn, draw on a very specific set of images, compositions, colors from another manuscript from Bijapur that was produced in 1547, that was kept in Lahore until 1870. A copy of this manuscript was commissioned by a British official in, I believe it was, yes, 1854. So what you have is an original Bijapuri courtly manuscript of the Ajaib al-Makhluqat in the Lahore Toshat Khana under, at that point it wasn't, well, you have a British commissioner in Lahore at that point who basically has a group of craftsmen create a reproduction of the Bijapuri manuscript. He then takes this perfect reproduction and sends it to the Universal Exhibition in Paris to be displayed as an example of sort of the Mohammedan arts of South Asia, is how he describes it in an inscription. So we now have a group of craftsmen who have copied exactly, they've made an exact replica of this 1857 Bijapuri Adil Shahi manuscript. These exact images get reproduced in lithograph in, basically a decade later, after the 1857, all of the rupture and violence of 1857, where presumably, the normal networks of craftsmanship and patronage would have been interrupted. These same images you find them being reproduced in lithograph form in, rather than Lahore, in Lucknow and some of the large presses of UP, basically. So what seems to have happened is that these craftsmen have traveled in search of work, and knowing what we know about methods of reproduction, the way that manuscripts were reproduced is they were often traced, and you have sort of pounces that were, it's quite possible, and again, this is purely speculative on my part, I would love to find material proof of how the craftsmen reproduced their drafts. But it is possible that they took these materials with them because the reproductions in some cases are so exact from the manuscript to the lithograph that they couldn't have been done purely through memory, I don't think. Here we go. So this is where I take you through the exact sort of dates when Charles Raikes, who is the East India Company servant, has a copy of this manuscript commissioned, when the, where the original manuscript is from, where the copy goes. And then these are all in the British Library's collection. So I was lucky enough to have access to all of them. So again, here you go. This is the original manuscript that was also later purchased by a British official and then found its way into the British Museum, if I'm not mistaken. And here you can see, you have in the middle is the original manuscript from Bijapur. Next to that on the left, you have the Lahore reproduction, which is also a manuscript. And then to the left of that, you have the lithograph. And you can see, especially Bijapur and the Lucknow lithograph, a clear echo in terms of color composition. And that is echoed throughout much of the imagery that you find in the lithograph copy. And I've just got a bunch of examples of that, which I will quickly take you through. So again, you have, again, I mean, it's very clear to see the way that the imagery gets reproduced in lithograph form. It's quite striking, in fact. And obviously there's a shared corpus of images that are associated with this particular cosmological imaginary. But what I would argue is that the composition and the colors and the entire way that it's reproduced seems to stem very directly in this case from a very specific manuscript. And I think it's rare that one is actually able to point to a specific manuscript and say, yes, this is where this lithograph copy seems to emanate. So anyway, we've kind of perhaps managed to answer the question of where this set of images comes from. And why is this interesting, basically? And again, you can see the wak tree gets almost reproduced. You have the manuscript copy and then the lithograph copy of the Ajaib al-Makhluqat. So from the lithograph copy of the Ajaib al-Makhluqat, which is a lithograph copy of the manuscript in its entirety, you then, what seems to happen is that the images are taken out or subtracted out of the narrative of the manuscript and reused and repurposed and reformulated in this set of Urdu lithographs, as you can see here. So it's the same imagery now. It's been sort of taken out of the text and reformulated entirely. So again, here are a few more visual examples of that. You have the different versions of the lithographs that have been, that show evidence of how this imagery was adapted. And because I would like to finish on time, I will jump straight to some of my conclusions. So my theory about what is going on with these lithographs and how and why they are remediating these images is that we go from, there's basically a shift happening in terms of how the images are being used. So I draw on another actual pre-modern manuscript genre, which is the pictorial divination or falnama, the pictorial divination text, whereby divination is done not by, through dreams or through, ilm ramal, but divination is performed through images and through the association of particular auguries with particular images. And so I would hazard the argument that the way that the images from the Ajaib al-Makhluqat manuscript tradition have been sort of repositioned on the page of the Urdu lithographs would lend itself to improvised auguries and divination. And because these treatises are often sandwiched between many other treatises that deal with other types of divination, right? So you'll have a dream interpretation treatise, you'll have a firasa treatise, you'll have, an ilm ramal treatise, and then, one on making talismans. And then next to that, you'll have these pictorial treatises. So I would hazard the guess that they are basically a remediation of the Ajaib al-Makhluqat cosmological tradition as a pictorial divination tool. So that I think is interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, for a number of reasons. One is that it gives access to, it gives a popular audience access to what is basically very high courtly cosmological imagery that would only have been available to an elite few, either at the 16th century court of Bijapur or the court of Lahore, where these manuscripts were kept and where they circulated within a very limited number of readers or viewers. Now what you have is the remediation of those images into a newly formulated type of text that then could circulate much more widely amongst a readership who maybe were not entirely literate. Because it's so heavy on imagery, I suspect that it gave rise to, as divination practices often do, different types of sociability in readers. If you are doing a divination for someone and improvising an augury, there are going to be two people involved. So my theory is that it gave rise to new types of readership and sociability. I would even hazard a guess that some of these texts were aimed at women and female readers, because you have some evidence suggesting that women were often involved in improvising auguries and divination. And some of the adjacent texts to these divination, pictorial divination treatises were written in the women's language, right, or Begumati Zaban. So, I mean, again, there's debate as to whether that's actually aimed at women or not. But I would like to imagine a world in which female readers could engage with these texts and images, and I would really see the act of divining through these images as a kind of improvisatory literary performance and an ephemeral literary performance. So I think that the creation of this type of sort of mass-produced lithograph that reconfigures the cosmos also reconfigured and gave rise to new forms of reading. So I think they're a very rich site for thinking about reading. Here we go. Here's some of my conclusions, which I've just delivered to you. I think they're a very rich site for theorizing the nature of reading and literary production. And they hint at the existence of worlds and practices that otherwise can be quite difficult to clearly document in texts. Another thing that the texts do, which I think is quite interesting, is that there is a presumption that the introduction of print in South Asia brought about something of a rupture, and that many of the previous forms of Islamicate intellectual transmission and production were interrupted by this technology. But what we really see here is that they weren't so much interrupted as remediated, reformulated, reinvented, and actually had the ability to circulate much more widely than they would have in manuscript form. So I think that rather than a rupture, we have a reformulating and a reimagining of what some of the pre-modern Islamicate knowledge and knowledge production was, and kind of what it did with its audiences. So, I mean, obviously, the other thing you can say is that, the line between, sort of the rationalist, reformist trends that rise up in South Asia in the second half of the 19th century, one can't reduce them to being sort of purely rationalistic in a very reductive sense of the word, because they often engage in dialogues around miracles, and also have a rich relationship with sort of concepts that we would consider to be quite enchanted or magical, even though they are sort of characterized historically as rationalist reform movements. So already that's a problematic distinction. But I do think it is worth pointing out that this was a technology, a colonial era technology, that actually gave more access to pre-modern Islamic knowledge and ways of reformulating it. And what's also very interesting, and I think that it really brings out the entanglement of British colonial patronage, artistic patronage and intellectual patronage, is that the access that, the way that these images became disseminated, I think, is through the fact that a British colonial official had a group of craftsmen reproduce a courtly manuscript, and then the craftsmen then take that knowledge and create these lithographs from it, I think is what happened. This is my theory. And so you have the entanglement of the British colonial presence that then actually facilitates access to these otherwise very elite courtly images that then become disseminated through this, also sort of Western technological innovation that winds up being a site of further Islamicate visual and intellectual inventiveness. So I think that this set of lithographs is interesting for a number of reasons, and it problematizes a number of these historiographical arguments within the field of South Asian studies. I will conclude there. And we can open up for a discussion and questions. And I should also just say I'm very much at the beginning of this research. I'm sort of 1.5 articles in and have many more to go. So I'm very keen to hear your recommendations for reading or how to approach for working on this. There's a sort of growing field of kind of South Asian lithograph studies. It's previously been neglected. So I'm very keen to hear anyone's recommendations. So thank you. Thank you very much for listening. Oh, I think you're muted. I can stop sharing my screen as well. Oh,
Thank you, Dr. Sobers-Khan. I'm sorry about that. I'm still not, mine doesn't coordinate with hand often. So I forget to unmute myself. That was a really fascinating presentation. And I was thinking so many things and wanting to ask so many questions, but let me just open it up to the audience so that they have a chance to do that before I monopolize what remains of our time. I don't see any raised hands. I don't know if there are any.
I see some people appearing.
Hallie or Haley, go ahead.
Hi, it's Hallie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. My question is about, I mean, I think your hypothesis about a kind of extempore literary file makes complete sense. I'm wondering if you've been able to find any kind of traces of this in the lithographs themselves. Like, have you seen any annotations maybe, or like, you know, thumbprints or something, indications that they might have been, you know, the spines cracked to indicate that people were opening them up for fall, that kind of thing. And as a related question, it seems that the Lucknow lithograph that you show was clearly connected to this earlier set of manuscripts doesn't have the commentary in the margins. And do you think that that might have enabled the text to be used more in this way that you're hypothesizing? Thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, those are great questions. Thank you. And the question of like how to determine readership is a fascinating one, right? Like, did people read these? How did they read them? What did it look like? What traces did they leave? I haven't come across anything as fascinating as annotations or sketches or thumbprints. I would love to, though. That were like someone spilling tea on their lithograph or something like this. But what you do find are, so basically the way that these lithographs are kept is that, and the way they were collected is that they're actually quite slim pamphlets, right? They're sort of chapbooks. And the way they were collected is that the then India Office Library would get a bunch of them that are sort of all within the same genre or subject area and bind them together. And so what you find are often, or sometimes within the same treatise, you'll find a bunch of different sort of sub-treatises as well, right? So occasionally you'll have, and the ones that I was looking at were no different. So sometimes you'll have all of them bound together. Sometimes you'll have one that has like 5 sub-chapters, and each chapter will address a different aspect of magic or divination. So what you do find that kind of hints at the way that these were being used is that sometimes within one treatise, you know, you'll have one chapter that is one of these things that I'm thinking is a pictorial falnama. You know, you'll have an instruction on how to make amulets, and then you'll also have a set of standard questions that people can ask the diviner. And that gives you a lot of insight into, and interestingly, they're usually in, I mean, they're always in a vernacular language, sometimes in Urdu, Hindi, Punjabi, and they give you a sense of what people wanted to know, like what questions were they asking of, you know, perhaps the images, perhaps other types of divination. So I think that I can't necessarily, you know, there isn't like an inscription in the margin that says, "Oh, this picture, I think, gave me this divination." But what you do find are, you know, adjacent questions, basically, like within the same sort of set of treatises of, you know, kind of things about marriage or crops or, you know, wealth or trade, or questions that people wanted to know about the future. So that's an additional kind of, I guess, you know, a brick in the wall of my argument that I'm trying to build up about how these lithographs were used. And then your other question about the commentary, I think that there is, I haven't actually examined a particular question. Question is a really good one. I think that something is going on around the question of language, because the Ajaib al-Makhluqat that gets reproduced in lithograph is actually a Persian one. And then from Persian, it gets translated into Urdu. And then from Urdu, the illustrations get subtracted out. And then you just have like these, you know, short captions underneath the image. So I don't know if, you know, if, I don't actually know what's going on there, except that maybe, you know, the only thing I can imagine right now, and if you have another suggestion, I would love to hear it, is that the people producing the lithographs saw an opportunity to reach a wider market, right? Because not everyone is going to know Persian as such. You know, not everyone is going to be educated to that degree. So, you know, you can translate it into Urdu, but then maybe people aren't even reading that much text. So we can just subtract out, you know, take the images and adapt those into a new format as well. So I think there might have been an element of kind of commercial acumen at work as well, you know, of different lithograph producers trying to create, you know, new genres of lithograph that could be sold more easily. That's one idea, but if you have, I would love to hear your
No,
input.
that's brilliant. Thank you so much. This is really interesting to hear. I mean, I'm kind of interested in when you have these massive marginalia that are in lithograph, but I've looked at it only for Persian, where it seems to be that it's in this later period where people's Persian is maybe less good, and there's this mania of like, let's put loads of Persian in the margins. Yeah. I think that I'm just less familiar with Urdu, so maybe people just didn't feel the need to do it in the vernacular. But thank you so much. That's great.
Well.
I think Marsha Hermanson is next.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was really fascinating. And I think my remarks are related to part of the previous conversation. I'm interested in divination. And I'm thinking of a number of things, and I understand this is still pretty preliminary, but you know, so one suggestion was, do you do the divination by opening the book and which picture comes up? Or could there have possibly been a more active role than even that for the questioner? So there's sort of who opens the book, and then, you know, could somebody be actually pointing, you know, like close your eyes and point at something. And then of course we don't know, we might have some hints about the questions, but in terms of the answers, for example, we do find in Western astrology that the sort of nature of the divinatory answers changes into modernity, especially in the 20th century, you know, with the rise of kind of a psychological vocabulary. So it's no longer outer things are going to happen to you, but this is about inner things. And I know this is much earlier, but I am thinking of the kind of potential storytelling role surrounding these images, and other Persianate traditions of, let's say, having a religious tableau and somebody going around and talking about the pictures in the tableau. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how all of that links together. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, those questions are all really, and comments are really spot on. I have a lot of thoughts about how all of that fits together, and not many conclusions. And one thing that kind of has occurred to me about these images is that, you know, I am not a 19th century woman in UP, like in Lucknow. Like perhaps if I were, the images wouldn't be as sort of mesmerizing and bizarre as I find them. You know, it could be that there was a storytelling tradition and a set of meanings and values attached to each of those images that was very clear to the audience, that isn't necessarily clear to us, which is why they seem, you know, perhaps more mysterious or bizarre or what have you. So I think it's very, very, very possible that there were stories attached to some of, or many of, or all of the images. And we know maybe what some of them are. Some of them are recounted in the captions underneath. And probably, I'm guessing we're just like a sort of, almost like a aide-memoire, right? For a set of stories that existed sort of popularly and circulated, I would guess. I don't know. You know, and the sort of recreating these oral traditions around things like divination, I think are very difficult, especially in this case where I'm guessing that women were involved. And so there's a whole set of like probably flex and, you know, meaning laden stories that were attached to the different images and symbols. One place where you do find a kind of answer to the divination, like what the answer of like what the meaning of each symbol is in dream interpretation treatises that exist, you know, often in these same side by these pictorial phenomena, where, you know, it's one of the places where, you know, this symbol means this thing, and it'll even be tabulated, right? You'll have a table and it'll be very clear. So it's actually, there's a real shift there from pre-modern dream interpretation treatises where you'd have like a bunch of text and a paragraph. This is a very much like, you know, sort of like diagrammatic, like systematized relationship. So you're right, there might be something going on like with a shift in modernity there as well. But one thing I haven't yet done that I would really like to do is see if there is any correspondence between the imagery that comes up in the dream interpretation treatises, where you have a clear meaning assigned to each set of images and symbols, and the imagery that occurs in the pictorial divination treatises that I talked about today. Honestly, I'm guessing that there isn't actually one, because I look at dream interpretation treatises in another set of research, and I haven't encountered a clear relationship between the two sets of imagery, between those two genres of divination. But yes, I mean, everything you've said is absolutely spot on. I do think that these are enmeshed in sets of stories that had sort of relational, multivalent meanings that could change according to who is doing the interpreting, and the situation and the context and the time of day and what zodiac sign you're in, and all of that. I think figuring out what that was is very difficult. We can only kind of rich interpretive traditions attached to all of these images. If anyone who does sort of oral histories, or I mean, I'm not an ethnographer by training, I don't really know how to do that kind of history, but for people who do, I would love to hear your input or advice on how to approach that question.
I think Hasib is next.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And wonderful session.
I don't think we can, we're unfortunately not able to hear you. I don't know if it's just me, but.
Okay. Now it's okay.
A little bit, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, some microphone issue is there. I'm talking from Kerala, and this is my pleasure to interact with you. So my question is, I'm not talking about these technical aspects of that lithography, purpose aspects of that lithography. I think my question is actually a continuation of the Marcia asked just a while ago, that in Kerala, still these type of picture are in practice, especially with these ulamas, religious ulamas, because we locally call them as the ustads. And for the spiritual treatment, they still using these type of pictures, especially these pictures like tree with the fruit, symbol of the woman, and men with a sun, and all these tortoise, all these symbolizing some of the spiritual meaning. And I think these type of tradition that goes back to the prehistoric painting as well, because as in the case of Bhimbedkar and almost all cave painting, they also picturize, or they also did this type of painting, mostly not based on the observation of the nature, but based on the imagination. So how do you connect all these things? Prehistoric people also using this type of imaginary vision. And during the 19th and 18th century, that tradition has been going on. And even today, 21st century is also some sort of these religious scholars still they have using these type of picturizing. And why we don't have to understand the real meaning behind this tortoise with man with sun, as well as the tree with fruit, after so much centuries almost completed right now. I think my question is clear. Thank you.
Okay, great. I think I managed to hear you okay. So I'm just going to say I can't draw as a historian, I can't draw a direct line between sort of prehistoric cave paintings and 19th century lithographs. My training does not permit me to do that. But what I can say is that your point of the fact that these types of practices and imagery are still in practice, and very actively in practice, is a really important one. Again, as a historian, I don't want to say like, okay, what people are doing now is the same as what they were doing in the 19th century or the early 20th century. We obviously can't say that, but I think that we can certainly draw on and investigate how these images and texts continue to have a very active life. So a side project that I'm doing is actually collecting contemporary chapbooks on divination and cosmology and talismans that you find produced and sold today, in particular outside of shrines in the subcontinent in India. I mean, mainly I've been in India and Pakistan doing this. And so I think that the fact that like the continued life of these images and and especially of talismans, and as you say, there are certain elements of the cosmological imagery that still have a very strong resonance, I would say, amongst believers, amongst people who believe that they have an efficacy in the world. That is very interesting. Again, as I said, I'm not an anthropologist. I only deal with dead people, living people. I don't know what to do with them. So, but I still think that having a look, I mean, I think that if we study the way that the 19th century lithographic imagery gets translated into chapbooks today, that are existing today and being reformulated and sold today, that process might help us understand a little bit better the previous process of the way that the imagery gets adapted and reformulated from the manuscript into the lithograph, and then from the lithograph into the contemporary pamphlets that are sold outside of shrines that deal with these exact same topics. Again, it's not a one-to-one line, but the processes are fascinating, and the process of kind of reinventing meaning and remediating and reusing these symbols and imagery, I think is, I mean, it tells us a lot also about meaning making and, and our relationship to the unseen and to the future. So I think that's certainly always a valuable endeavor. But yeah, in terms of the prehistoric cave painting, or the notion that there's some kind of like Platonic meaning assigned to each of these symbols, that I can't really comment on. And I think that the symbols are very much culturally and socially embedded and contextualized, and that's where they derive their meaning from, as a social and cultural historian. So if that's helpful at all.
Nicholas Roth has a question now.
Hi, thank you for this lovely talk. I have a question that's sort of that's hopefully not too out of left field, but just sort of moving away from the divination angle a little bit. I was wondering if you could speak at all to how some of this adapting, reusing, recirculating of images in Urdu lithographs of this type might relate to the practice of illustrating, of using images in sort of other genres of Urdu publications that are rising at this time, sort of on the more sober and practical end of things, quote unquote. As you know, for my own research, I've looked primarily. I look primarily at manuscripts, but I even have looked at lithographs. It's been texts primarily on agriculture and gardening and things like that. And there too, there's sort of this sudden, with late 19th century lithographs, you suddenly get illustrations, which there are in that case don't exist in the manuscript tradition at all. And there's one, for example, very lavishly illustrated one from Hyderabad at the British Library, the Zirat as-Safiya, that has these wonderful illustrations, but and a lot of them make sense. A lot of the ones of actual practice and all make sense, and they're sort of clearly coming from the same sort of type of illustrations as the ones you get for like Masnavis and things like that around the same time, the sort of little courtly scenes. But then a lot of it clearly also culled from Victorian nursery catalogs and things like that. And those often make no sense. Like they're labeled as, X, but they're actually Y. They're in the wrong place in the text. They're just, but they're abundant and beautiful. Which is obviously a different thing, but just one example as well. But given that, I just sort of wonder like how this might relate to the sort of larger practice of, on the one hand, the lithograph's ability to reproduce sort of certain features of manuscript culture, on the other hand, this sudden new world of illustration that both reproduces tradition and is how that relates to these sort of illustrations of marvels potentially, or how they fit into this larger scene.
That's a brilliant question, and it's one I'm also thinking a lot about. I would postulate that there is, exactly as you've identified, like almost, I'm imagining, I don't know, but what it looks to me, having looked at a lot of these lithographs and having looked at a lot of lithographs that are not within the divination sort of genre, as you say, things relating to gardening or love stories or really anything else, you do find the same images reproduced across different genres as well. And what it looks to me like is that you have almost a set of stock images that circulated, maybe within a workshop or maybe between different workshops, that get reused and repurposed according to sort of what the creator of that lithograph needed. So this, I think, really needs to be studied. It's something, so I've observed that this exists in across languages as well, right? So you might have, sort of translations from, or not translations, but different renditions or versions of, say, a love story or a love poem. And many of the illustrations will be the same, or you'll find some version of those illustrations in another text that has nothing to do with that narrative. So I definitely think that, yeah, you've absolutely like asked a really spot on question of like what was going on with illustrations in 19th century lithographs, because clearly the methods of production are completely different than manuscripts, and so it really affects the way that these images are being used and reproduced. So yeah, absolutely. I don't know, but I think that this is like a topic for a dissertation, a PhD dissertation, like waiting to happen, and that we would all really benefit a lot from it. So
thank
yeah,
you.
Yeah.
Well, if nobody else has a question, maybe you wouldn't mind fielding something from me. And this is going to sound very kind of basic and uninformed, forgive me, because this is a completely new, an introduction that you provided to a field that I know nothing really about. But it seems to me from the plot that you traced for us in the research that you have done on these lithographs, a sort of 13th century manuscript ends up being transmitted to a 16th century Deccan, right, court,
Absolutely.
which, thanks to the intervention of a colonial individual, Charles Raikes, right, unleashes this, cottage industry that travels from the Deccan to the north, to places like Lahore and Lucknow, where all of a sudden, this Bijapuri manuscript has this new life and has spawned endless copies, which are now being, used by possibly women or others in northern India. I mean, so what are we saying here exactly? I mean, are we saying that this is a kind of moment of cultural efflorescence that of a particular kind in Islamic India? Or are we saying that an older tradition might have been replaced by something that print technology allowed to become more popular? In other words, what did people do? How did they know about these mythical creatures and oddities of nature, these marvels and wonders of creation? Did they know, or was this something that, and if so, how? Or was this something that they discovered only in the late 19th century? Thanks to fire.
Yeah, so I think the overarching argument, one of the overarching arguments that I'm trying to make is that this particular technology of the lithograph allowed for the sort of reinvention and reimagining and reformulation of many of these narratives and imagery from the manuscript tradition. And the question of basically their reception, right? Like, how did people receive them? How did they know how to interact with them? I think is what you're asking. And I think it's not something I've actually written about yet or gone into much detail about, but I would presume, and there are, experts in the Zoom room on this much greater than me, but I would presume that there was an oral tradition that circulated around many of these stories that allowed them to allowed this imagery to be
instantly popular,
interpreted, popular, to have some kind of a set of meanings and interpretations and symbols associated with it already through a kind of already circulating popular vernacular set of legends and myths and stories that existed, which allowed it to have this
reception. I think that's what someone in the chat was suggesting. That was suggested by Hakim or Hakim Samir in the chat, that these images found a receptive audience because they were already familiar.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm just seeing his comment now. That's absolutely spot on. I mean, I would surmise that. I don't have any proof of that, but I would think that would be the case, that there was already a very widely circulating set of symbols and images and oral tradition and lore and stories that and to me the novelty is not so much the stories or the symbols, it's actually having the visuals represented on a page, drawing on a courtly manuscript tradition that's now circulating widely and being mass produced amongst a popular
outside the court. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So to me, that's the new element in this, and the argument is that rather than creating a rupture, these new print technologies allowed for the remediation and reformulation of this imagery and injected new life, I would say, into perhaps some of the narratives and stories and some of these sort of pre-modern Islamicate genres of knowledge production.
If you don't mind. So one other thing that I found kind of fascinating in your story, in your presentation rather, was the fact that Charles Raikes, was it, the colonial official, commissioned these copies of the Bijapuri manuscript in order to exhibit them in Paris at the Imperial Exhibition in the 50s, right? As a kind of exhibit A of freakishness, the circus.
Interestingly, it was framed as in the sort of 19th century Orientalist terminology of Mohammedan arts and sciences, so Islamic arts and sciences. It wasn't, I mean, the notion, one interesting debate I feel like within the wider kind of Ajaib and Makhluqat field of study is about whether these images were actually freakish to their viewers or not, right? So it could be that
at home or in the West. I mean, I think it's just an interesting instance of Orientalism, if you will.
I mean, definitely. I mean,
there was this whole other life that these manuscript images had sort of in the West, and a whole other audience and popularity that they had, kind of completely separate, existing in this completely separate universe.
Absolutely. And I haven't actually traced that branch yet, other than to kind of recognize that it was probably through the commissioning of this manuscript that these craftsmen got trained, that allowed them then to reproduce those images in lithograph. But the other kind of life that the manuscript had, being sent off to the Universal Exhibition, and how it was read and interpreted by a French audience, that I haven't yet examined. And I mean, it's a very interesting, very separate question. But yeah, it's a very good, and the fact that all of these wind up in the British Library, of course, right? The Bijapuri one from 1847, and then all of these lithographs as well, is a whole other separate research question around the nature of the removal of cultural heritage from its place of origin, and a whole other separate critique for sure. So.
A whole series of ajaib.
Yeah, there's so much to say about this corpus, I would say. Yeah, there's really a lot to say.
Right.
So yeah, a certain continuation, the annual Nowruz. Yeah, absolutely. And just responding to Hakim Samir Hamdani, there's a huge resonance with popular visual culture in South Asia still that I really want to examine and look into and see, like, where the echoes still exist and where these these images from the lithographs still you know, where they take on a life today, because I've seen examples of definitely where and how they get sort of echoed and reproduced and reinterpreted. I just need to document it a bit more. I have like a stack of modern chapbooks that have just been produced the other day that reproduce sometimes almost the exact talismans and exact kind of instructions for making them, as you find in the lithographs, which you also find in the manuscript. So there's something fascinating going on there that I would like to do more work on in my copious free time.
So in answer to a question in the chat from Ravi Prakash, the presentation will be uploaded, and I will turn the mic over now to Aisha Nur so she can tell you more about that. And I have to head out to give head to another screen to give my class, but it's been a real pleasure and such a wonderful, educational, informative, tantalizingly curiosity-making presentation, Dr. Sobers-Khan. So I thank you very much. And I'm sure the audience feels likewise.
Thanks so much for moderating, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to discuss this work with such a great audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nur Sobers, and thank you, Dr. Hamdani. So to the question, yes, if our speaker agrees, we will post this recording on our website. So you can also follow us on the Facebook and Twitter accounts. So we also announce that there. Thank you so much, everyone.